Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course Environmental Impact Assessments, and in today's session we are going to cover land acquisition, resettlement and livelihoods from the perspective of all the legal aspects, as well as what kind of policies are there and what kind of institutional arrangements are there, or standards or guidelines are there. So we'll look at that, and if you may connect that, this is what we have been covering for a couple of lectures here. So for this session, our main reference from the textbook would be chapter 15 from the book of Terrible and Wood, 2018. So our coverage would include that first we are going to look at the key concepts and definitions, and then we'll look at international financial institutions and also understand about equator principles. Then we'll look into resettlement framework and resettlement action plan, like what it is and what kind of work has to be taken within this framework. And then we'll look at social impact of the project in this particular domain dealing with land acquisition and resettlement aspect. Then we'll look into Indian context, where we'll try to understand what kind of rights to property we have. We'll just touch upon that. And then we'll also look at the key legislation in this, that's the right to fair compensation and transparency in land acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act of 2013. So our learning outcomes, what we expect to understand after completing this particular session, is that we should be able to define these concepts, the key terms, we should be able to define them. And we should be able to identify the key international financial institutions, the kind of guidelines they provide, legislations they provide, the legal instruments they provide, and then also the equator principles and similar kind of guidance which is given by them. And then you should be able to discuss key approach and documentation which is required within land acquisition and resettlement. Then you should be able to discuss the social impact which one needs to consider within the domain of land acquisition and resettlement. Then you should be able to locate the Indian context, like what is the scenario here, and explain the key act and the elements of right to property, and then the right to fair compensation and transparency in land acquisition, rehabilitation and resettlement act. So starting with the key concepts and definitions, think about the negative impact of land acquisition and displacements. You have been reading and listening about it, and think about you being in that situation. So as per the World Bank study, which really discusses this and brings forward all these components, the study on impoverishment, risk and reconstruction IRR framework, which identifies that there are certain negative impact of resettlement, like there's cases of there's displacements because of resettlement, there's landlessness, there is joblessness, people lose job, then people lose homelessness, then there is also marginalization, then there is also increased morbidity and mortality. So those kind of things happen. Then there is increase in food insecurity, loss of access to common property, and there's also social disarticulation. So many problems arise out of resettlement when one has to be relocated. It's also like there are a lot of problems, but it's also considered that when all the impacts are all the risks are taken into perspective, consideration, proper planning is done, then the same project with good consideration and involvement could change the outcome. So the outcome, like what we saw from that we are looking at negative impact as landlessness, so that from that we can have land-based resettlements, we can have re-employment from joblessness, and then we can have house reconstruction from homelessness. So we can look at social inclusion, and then we can have improved health care, we can have adequate nutrition, and then we can also see how we can restore community assets and services, likewise how we can build the network and community when we really take into consideration all these kind of impact and plan properly for these things. So further, there is also developing understanding and recognition of the risk involved in business if all the aspects of projects are not well considered. So it's just not that it is one needs to do it. It's there are certain impact, and for the environmental clearance one needs to do it. But then it is also the understanding is evolving that it's due consideration and taking consideration of all the involved risk. It helps to really improve the business as well. So based on that context, we see will now have certain conceptual clarity. So there's term like voluntary and involuntary settlements. So like what is voluntary settlements? Like settlement, when we look at resettlement is a planned process where you plan the process of relocating people and community from one place to another. And we say voluntary resettlement when in situations where project proponents have no alternative to government expropriation or other enforcement mechanism, and people cannot be compelled to surrender their land. So when people cannot be really forced to surrender their land, then you say it's a voluntary resettlement. For example, you can see that like indigenous people, the tribal people have constitutional right to their land and would only agree, they would be only relocated when they agree to the project, they give their consent to the project to occupy the land. So when that consent is taken free, in a free environment, prior and informed consent is taken, only then that land can be willingly taken from them. So such kind of things are said to be voluntary resettlement. And when we say involuntary resettlement, it is considered when resettlement takes place without informed consent. So when there is no consent of the people who are being displaced, the affected people who are being displaced, there is no consent of theirs, then it is said involuntary resettlement. And also in the cases where they do not have the power to refuse the resettlement. So many a times they are forced to agree to what is being offered. So when they do not have that power to refuse the resettlement, irrespective they agree with that or not, so that's said to be involuntary resettlement. So now we saw the voluntary resettlements, we saw involuntary resettlements, and we saw what resettlement means. So also we may note that government has the power of eminent domain. So there's a term eminent domain, meaning government has the right to land expropriation. That means to take away your private property for public use with payments of compensation. So they can compensate you for the land which they have taken. So meaning they have meaning they can compulsorily acquire land when projects are considered to be in public interest. So, if it's for the larger good, for everyone's benefit, then the government has that power to take that land from you. So think of all the situation in which the government can take the land from you, and then it can be it's like most of the projects, all of the projects can be supported for public interest purpose. So we see that what IFC, World Bank, suggests that in cases that one needs to really negotiate, and negotiation is seen as a best practice. So one needs to promote negotiation in the process of acquiring land. And forced relocation is bad for business, so that's not really good, and that may have a lot of consequences in terms of protests, delay, and a lot of legal actions, and that can be very expensive for the project proponent. So, in most of the cases, that should be avoided, and negotiation should be made when there are no consent. So, one should come to a common agreement there. So, wherever, even in the cases where the government uses its eminent domain, or land has to be acquired, it is always desirable that there's a negotiated agreement that should be taken care of, and for the resettlement process. And this particular process, where the agreement, there's lack of consent, but there is negotiated agreement, so that is said to be negotiated involuntary resettlement. And it's in cases where it is unavoidable, it is promoted by the international standard, and it is viewed as the best practices. So negotiation is one of the important aspects here, to really come to an agreement and have better exchange of the concerns and also the sharing of values here. So even if there is negotiated process under IFC Performance Standard 5, the condition pertaining to involuntary resettlement still apply and must be considered. So there'll be also norms and standards which have to be followed here. So in any situation of resettlement, irrespective of use of eminent domain, we also see that the compensation should be paid for those who are displaced. So compensation is mandatory, that has to be done, and there are guidelines which suggest how those considerations have to be taken care of and how those processes have to be followed. So we see that learning the term compensation. Compensation means the payment in cash or in kind for an asset or a resource that is acquired or affected by a project at the time the asset needs to be replaced. So you see what compensation means. This I have taken from the IFC performance standards. Then you also see host population. What do we really mean by that? People living in or around areas to which people physically are displaced by a project and who have to be resettled, and they would be affected by the resettlement. So they would be considered as the host population. Then you also see terms like vulnerable groups. So these are people who by the virtue of the gender or by the ethnicity, age, physical or mental disability or the economic disadvantage or the social status will face the negative impact of the resettlement. So they would be considered as the vulnerable group. And they might have limited capability to take advantage of whatever is being proposed. So you need to take care of that as well, and you understand what we really mean by vulnerable groups. And then you see the project affected households. So this term is used for all the members of the household, whether related or not related, and they work together as an economic unit, and this household is referred as a project affected household if they are affected by a project. So that's about the vulnerable group and project affected household. Further, one needs to understand the livelihood concept, and there's significance of restoring of livelihood, and it should not be limited to the compensation part itself, but one needs to ensure that the impacted communities are not at disadvantage in the process of when you're taking away land from that. So you have to see that we just not only give them money, but we also restore their livelihood when their lands are being taken away. So this is an important concept, restoration of livelihoods, in resettlement planning. And then we see that people can be seriously affected by the project, even when they do not have to be physically relocated. So even if we are not relocating them, then also they can get seriously affected, especially when their livelihood opportunities or access to livelihood is hindered or obstructed by the interventions you are doing there. So, for example, the if a highway is coming up and then it splits the site into two parts, the agriculture field into two parts, and no longer the farmer is able to go to the other side and use the major chunk of the land which is available to that. So that hampers the person, though that person is not really being relocated, but there is reduced income, there can be drastic reduced income in that. So that kind of displacement is called economic displacement. So understanding the term, what does livelihood means? It's the full range or means that individual or families and the communities utilize to make a living, such as wage-based income, agriculture, fishing, foraging, other natural resource-based livelihood, petty trades, and bartering. So all these are livelihoods, and then any interference in this could be an economic displacement. So another important concept is the cutoff date. Cutoff date is set as under the national law that permits the project to freeze further development on the land to be acquired by the project. So it's an important date by which everything should be attained. And cutoff date addresses also to the date of completion of the all the census, all the documentation, and assets inventory of persons affected by the project. Persons occupying the project area after the cutoff date are not eligible for compensation and or resettlement assistance. And then you also have fixed assets which are documented, such as built structure, crops, fruit trees, and wood lots, the forest trees and all. And then you establish the data of completion of all assets inventory, and then or an alternatively mutually agreed on date will not be compensated. So in principle, people must be compensated for all improvement that occurred before the cutoff date, but do not need to be reimbursed for any improvements made after that date. So only when the declaration is made, the cutoff date is decided, only till then they are compensated. So we see, you must have heard about such kind of problems like a lot of delay which between the cutoff date and actual relocation. So that also causes a lot of project cost, adds to the project cost. And then you must have also heard about problems of speculation of or opportunistic behavior, where whenever the projects are declared, people start buying, purchasing things at the lower cost so that one can acquire or one can sell it at a higher rate for the land acquisition purpose. So these kind of problems are very common, which one looks at it. So as a professional, you might have to deal with that. So that was about some of the relevant concepts. There are many concepts. I've just chosen some of them so that we understand things. So now looking at the international financial institutions and equator principles. You see that most of the international banks have developed their standards and guidance, and we also see convergence and integration among them. So there are a lot of standards and guidance which have been prepared, and then there's a lot of commonalities and integration which have been worked out among them. So you can find Environment and Social Framework (EFS) developed by World Bank. The environment and social framework, this requires the bank and it's like the people who borrow, the agencies which borrow, to evaluate and manage environmental and social risk. And they are supposed to inform and consult the stakeholders, and they are required to compensate certain project affected people. And this is mandatory requirement for projects for which want to take funds. And then we see that environmental and social framework is mostly used by the government agencies. And in this way, we see that bank also contributes in a way for supporting and encouraging projects that are environmentally and socially sustainable. So encouraging people to have more environmentally and sustainable approach towards project planning. And it also targets to improve the ability of the project developers. So the guidelines are given to them. So it also improves their capacity to handle such kind of environmental and social risk, and also to reduce the project negative impact of the project. And we see that bank has defined specific environmental and social standards, which are also referred as ESS. And these are designed to avoid or to minimize or to reduce or mitigate the adverse environmental and social risk and the impacts of the project. So I've provided you the link, and you can see the environmental and social framework here. So you'll also find IFC performance standards on environmental and social sustainability. These are usually used by the commercial projects. The previous one you saw was mostly used by the government agencies. So we also see that IFC performance standards are also applied for the equator principal banks. So the banks which align network together in equator principles. So it is also applied for them. So what is equator principle? Equator principles are they are common baseline and risk management framework, which puts all the financial institutions together to identify and access and manage environmental and social risk when financing the project. So they have a certain framework together. So equator principles, it is applied globally and to all the industry sectors and 5 financial products. You see this: project financing advisory services, project finance, project related corporate loans, bridge loans, project related refinance, and project related acquisition finance. So you see how the project proponents are maneuvered to align their development projects with the environmentally or sustainable development approach. So the IFC performance standard, the compliance with that is increasing, and here you see that it is also required by the equator principal banks, and equator principle is a sustainability framework for the global finance industry. So we see that 127 finance institutions in 38 countries have officially adopted the Equator Principles. So through them, IFC standards are applied in the EIA of the development projects. So looking briefly into Equator Principles, they have become the financial industry standards for environmental and social risk management in projects. Financial institutions adopt EP to ensure that the projects they finance are developed in a socially responsible manner and reflect sound environmental management practices. And by doing so, by adopting this, negative impact on project affected ecosystems and communities can be avoided wherever possible, or if it is unavoidable, then that can be reduced to a certain extent, and then mitigation and compensation can be appropriately extended. So we further see that IFC provides guidance on how the resettlement action plan has to be prepared. So you find all these guidances here. So you find a handbook for preparing a resettlement. So the key purpose of this includes that it is desirable to avoid resettlement. At the first place, it should not happen, and when resettlement is unavoidable, then it is required that the displacement will take place by exploring alternative project designs. So the proponents would look at alternative project designs, and forced evictions have to be avoided here. And then we also see that adverse social and economic impacts of land acquisition or restrictions on the land use to be avoided. If that is not possible, then it has to be minimized, and how one can minimize by providing compensation for the loss, or by having ensuring the resettlement activities are implemented with appropriate disclosure of information, and people are properly consulted, and all the information is given to the people who are affected by the project. And also it should be considered that not only reduce the negative impact, but one should also improve or restore the livelihoods and standard of living of the displaced people. Further, there is also needs to improve the living conditions among physically displaced persons through the provision of adequate housing with security of tenure at the resettlement site. So those land protection and all other things should also be provided here. So performance standard 5 of IFC, we see that it requires any compensation should be paid in full replacement cost, and which is defined as per the market value of the assets plus what they would be spending in terms of transaction cost. And major impact on resettlement people relates to valuation of their assets and extent of compensation they receive. So PS5 requires that people are not made worse off, that they are fairly compensated. So one needs to see that they are fairly compensated, their situation doesn't worsen here. Further, we also see that IFC standard requires that the project not only compensates for the lost asset, but goes the extra step to ensure that impacted households are able to re-establish a livelihood, and ideally that their livelihoods are improved. Then we also see that in IFC, IFC provides guidance on how the stakeholders' engagement has to be undertaken, and how different project proponents have to be involved during planning and monitoring, and how participatory monitoring has to be taken care of. So how people are involved in the entire, not only in the planning part, but they are also involved in monitoring of the project. And it is this guidance also provides information on how to address project induced in migration. So because of the project, a lot of people are going to come in, that would also change a lot of dynamics, and there will be other impact as well. So how one would take care of that, that is also addressed here, and how to address any project affected grievances if there are problems, complaints, how that has to be taken care of, and how to undertake cumulative impact, and then how to undertake local procurement. So those guidelines are provided. And slightly we'll try to understand what this local procurement means. Local procurement refers to purchase of goods and services from the local businesses. Typically this occurs in emerging markets and in developing markets where local communities have expectations. So whenever the projects come, they have expectation about participating in the upcoming opportunities. So you can see it in many of the newly developing areas. And then local procurement is also called as business linkages, local supplier development, local content, or local sourcing. Local procurement. So you also use this term, and this has been increasingly used as a strategic business tool. So you also see that it provides guidance on strategic community investments. So also that how that investment can be done. You can see the handbook provides guidance on how business development can support community investment programs that are successful, sustainable, and consistent with their own business objectives. So that can also be done here. Further, you see IFC defines strategic community investment, looking into what is strategic community investment. It is the voluntary contribution or actions by companies to help communities in their areas of operation to address their development priorities and take advantage of opportunities created by private investment in ways that are sustainable and support business objectives. So, there are many of the high income countries, they may not follow IFC guidelines because they have very strong environmental and social regulations and institutions inbuilt. But we see that IFC guidelines are usually followed by many countries and many agencies. You see that. So that was about the international level of guidance which has been provided. Now looking at the resettlement framework and kind of documents which have to be prepared. So as per IFC Performance Standard 5, resettlement framework is required to be prepared. This document indicates how the project proponent will approach in national legislation and also in addressing any gap as per the IFC performance standards. So how the proponent is going to address all these problems, how they are identifying it, and how are they aligning it with the national legislation, what laws are there in place. So accordingly, they are supposed to prepare a resettlement action plan, which this resettlement action plan provides complete details of the project, resettlement process, and why likely impacts will occur and what mitigation measures will be taken as per the impact, what will happen. And then also they have to prepare livelihood restoration framework. This document may be also prepared, and then livelihood restoration plan can also be prepared as per the impact. So whatever impact would happen based on this framework, they would identify, and how they are going to mitigate that they would prepare within the livelihood restoration plan. So this resettlement action plan is umbrella document, and it's a very powerful document in the process of resettlement. So that was about the required documents. Now we'll look at the framework of social impacts of the projects. So within the domain of resettlement, so we'll look at that. So as you can already understand that this process is very, very complex, and what kind of impact it has. So there is a social framework for project development given by Smith and Van Clay, which provides a conceptual and practical model for identification and assessment and communication of all impacts to all stakeholders. So, in this social framework, 8 categories are seen. So, you can see these categories. So, the categories 1, it talks about people's capacity, abilities, and freedom. This particular category is like where we look at how capable they are, how capable the community are to achieve their goal. And these goals can be basic as like human rights goal, where how capable are they to address to their family health, address to minimum nutrition which is required, and then how capable are they to work inside and outside the household and attain educations and skill, and then if any kind of change happens. Further, you can also within this you can also see how much workforce they have. The household might have children, they might have elderly and sick, which might limit their capacity in terms of the availability of labor. And then you might also see that there might be women who may not have freedom to fully engage in livelihood. And likewise, you can see that in this, even the people's aspiration and fear could also come and create stress when such kind of things happen. So, other category we see is the community social support and political context. So, it's important to understand when we are looking at such kind of rehabilitation, then it's important to understand how different interest group work and what kind of change would happen and what kind of social support is already there and what kind of change it would lead to. And these changes usually happen because of the in-migration and out-migration which might happen, which might disrupt the social support and might bring in different interest groups. So, it is very important that a meaningful consultation process is applied during the process. Another important category we see is culture and religion, which is one of the most important aspects to understand from the community's perspective. And as we see that there are a lot of attachment which is there to certain religious structure and shrine, which needs to be considered in project planning. So, there can be a lot of problems later if it is ignored at the initial stage. And you also need to understand the tangible cultural and intangible cultural heritage. You also need to take care of the indigenous people, especially they have particular attachment, strong attachment to their culture, and which needs to be protected in accordance with their what they aspire for. Another category which we see is livelihood assets and activities. So, it's important to understand wide range of resources on which one is or household is dependent upon. There can be primary and supplementary livelihood support. For example, one could be working as well as must be also earning through rental or pension and so on. And then there can be a lot of formal and informal activities also, including there can be a lot of legal as well as illegal activities. So, you need to understand those aspects. And you also see that there's also a vast dependency on the infrastructure and services, and this infrastructure and services could be both physical infrastructure as well as human resource dependency. So, those network, those access have to be understood and those need to be maintained. And we also see a housing and business structure, which is like a basic consideration. You may have to look into informal housing as well. Informal housing, when we say that when people build structure on the land they don't own, or situation in which people are squatting, they have certain challenges. So, all those things have to be also taken care of. You also need to take care of land and natural resources. Access to land, water bodies, forest and other natural resources necessary for conducting many livelihood activities. So, you see that those are not blocked, and And many of those are, you might also notice that they are governed by community or traditional or political institutions as well. And further, you also need to have a good understanding of land tenure, which is required for this purpose. And then also the living environments, the quality of life, access to clean water, air, and all those is also a desirable condition which has to be addressed. So, this was about how the complex the process is and how the social impact part also becomes a project within a project when you deal with land acquisition and resettlement. So, summarizing what we have covered today. So, we looked at the key concepts and definitions. Then we looked at international finance institution, and we also tried to understand what are the equator principles. And then we looked at the resettlement framework and resettlement action plan and what kind of document requirements are there. Then we looked at how within this domain what kind of social impact assessment and categories one looks into. So that was all for today, and these were the references, and these are the suggested reads and watch. And please feel free to ask questions, let us know about any concerns you have. Do share your opinions, experiences, and suggestions. Looking forward to interacting and co learning with you while exploring EIA. So, thank you.